So, welcome to those joining us from elsewhere for our exploration of the mystery of Good Friday. And I think as people have reflected on the meaning of this part of the story for a long time, no one has really explored it deeply and thoughtfully without being changed, without being challenged in some way to reconsider the previous meaning structure of their lives. And let's begin by looking at this passage from the letter to the Hebrews. This isn't the only explanation or way of understanding Good Friday, the suffering and death of Jesus, but it's how the Jewish mind understood it, or the Jewish Christian mind understood it. If then these sacrifices, he's talking about the whole history and mythology of sacrifice in the biblical tradition, and the cross was situated within this symbolism of sacrifice. So if these earlier sacrifices cleanse the copies of heavenly things, those heavenly things themselves require better sacrifices to cleanse them. In other words, the sacrifices of the past tradition, the religious tradition, were not absolute. They didn't fundamentally change things. Whereas for the Jewish Christian, the sacrifice of Christ is definitive in the sense that it has moved us on, it's changed the game. For Christ has entered not the sanctuary made by human hands, which is only a symbol of the reality, but heaven itself, to appear now before God on our behalf. Nor is he there to offer himself again and again, as the high priest enters the sanctuary year by year with blood not his own. So let's wait for people to come in. So we're looking at the letter to the Hebrews. So nor is he there to offer himself again and again, the idea of a repetitive sacrifice, a ritual sacrifice, somewhat as we say them, as we celebrate Mass every day or regularly. But he's entered into a different realm. If that was so, he would have had to have suffered many times since the world was made. But as it is, he has appeared once and for all at the climax of history, to abolish sin by the sacrifice of himself. So that sentence really captures the pivotal meaning in the Christian understanding of the theology of the cross and the meaning of the cross. He appeared once and for all, so something definitive, unique, at the climax of history. Could you turn off your mobile phones as well, if you could? To abolish sin by the sacrifice of himself. So let's try to reflect on what that might mean, to abolish sin. And as it is the lot of men, the destiny of men to die once, and after death comes judgment, so Christ was offered once to bear the burden of human sin, and will appear a second time, sin now done away with, to bring salvation to those who are watching for him. So we have here, I think, some of the essential elements of the meaning of Good Friday in Christian understanding. We have the idea that the sacrifice of Jesus, or the cross, the way he entered into his death, made it into a sacrifice. But this is comparable with the whole ancient history of human sacrifice, so it's part of the grammar of sacrifice in human religious consciousness, but it is something different, something definitive. He has done away with sin. The idea of sacrifice was that it was a way of dealing with sin, human imperfection, the repetitive nature of human failure, human infidelity, human cruelty. So sacrifice was meant to put us right with God, or the gods, or the higher powers, or the people or the forces that controlled the seasons and the crops and fertility. So sacrifice was there as a constant rebalancing or recalibrating of the cosmic relationship with humanity, in order to deal with the fact that human beings are constantly unbalancing or in danger of ruining the balance. So sacrifice was part of that economy of rebalancing and reharmonizing the relationship of humanity with nature and with the personified forces of nature. So the letter to the Hebrews is saying here that actually, so it's part of that grammar. We can understand it, we can use this word sacrifice about it, but we have to use it in a different way, because sin is not just going to be, can no longer be seen just as part of the repetitive problem of humanity, getting it right again and again, but sin has been transcended. So we have to come back to think about what sin means. And that because this is so pivotal, it can be understood as the climax of human history, as the balancing point. The climax, or the center, is where balance is found. So it's here in Christian vision, and how many people fully accept this or understand it or open to it is another matter. But this is the Christian insight and understanding of the meaning of the cross, the death of Jesus. And that also, what we see here is that there is at the same time a waiting, that this has happened, it's definitive, but we are waiting for the second coming, that we are still in another period of transition. In Tibetan Buddhism, they have the understanding of 6 bardo realms. These are transitional states. And bardo simply means an interval, really, but when somebody dies, they go into a bardo realm as they wait for rebirth. So we'll look at this idea of where Jesus is after he dies in the Christian understanding. But the understanding here is that although there's something definitive, final, and history changing in the cross, at the same time we are still waiting for the second coming. So this is a scriptural in the letter to the Hebrews, from the tradition that Jesus himself was formed by and belonged to. Here is a reflection in that language, in that mythology of the meaning of the cross. Now we approach it, I think, enriched by that understanding, but also aware that every culture, every faith tradition, and every period of history, and every individual has to find their own way, and will continue always to be finding new ways of understanding the meaning of the cross, which remains a mystery. The great teacher of the early church, Origen, called Christ the vast ocean of mystery. And one thing we can say about death is that it gives mystery to life. If we could imagine, I suppose, as we might fantasize, possibility of a life without death, what would we be living? How would we make sense of this endless flow of, presumably we would be just replacing our spare parts continuously. How much of us would be left of the original is another matter. We know we change our cellular structure, I think, every 7 years anyway. So who are we is a basic question of all life. But death poses that question very poignantly and painfully. There's a certain moment in life where we become aware of death, isn't there? I remember, I think, I don't know how old I was, maybe about 10 or 9 or 10, and it suddenly hit me. I must have thought about it or seen something about death. And I suddenly realized that there was death around, and people were talking about it, and it seemed to make them sad, and it made me very curious, and even a little impatient to have a death happen, see what it was like. Children are a bit hard-hearted like that. And unfortunately I got my wish very quickly, because very soon after that my grandmother died. And it was my first experience of death close to me. So, and then after that, there's no end to it. So death is a part of life. We can't make sense of ourselves or of our relationship to other people without taking into account the reality of death. That's why every spiritual tradition has, as one of its practices, a memento mori, the actual deliberate reflection on the fact of our mortality. We have to push ourselves to that, because it's not something we normally think about, unless we're sick or dying, or we're with someone who is sick or dying. So these spiritual traditions have a specific practice of reminding us of the horizon of our existence. St. Benedict, of course, says one of the tools of good works, the spiritual toolbox, is to keep death always before your eyes. And the purpose of that is, of course, not to be... Lost connection. Is not to become morbid about it, death-centered, depressed, fatalistic, hopeless, feeling that there's no point in doing anything because we're all going to die anyway. That's not the purpose of keeping death before your eyes. The purpose is so that we can live to the full. We can live with a zest and a wonder and an enjoyment of life. So there is a real paradox here. So life without death would have no mystery. And it's the mystery that allows us to expand. If we don't feel life has a mystery, or is a mystery, it becomes very flat-lined, it becomes very one-dimensional. It becomes like a shopping mall. You just go from one purchase to another, or one sensation or stimulus to another. And the advertising or the promotion gets less and less convincing in the consumer mentality. So you may become addicted to it. The shopping malls may be packed on Saturdays and on Good Fridays, but it doesn't feed or nourish our human growth. So if that's true of death, it's also true of suffering, because death is suffering. There may be suffering in preparation for death, painful illness, the suffering that Jesus went through, which we'll recall today in the Passion. But death itself is suffering. Death could be sudden and, and painless, but it involves suffering, both for that person who is moving into another realm, with the loss of everything that is familiar, even of one's own sense of identity, and of course certainly suffering for those who are left behind. So today offers us, and I think a lot of people in our post-Christian world are rather puzzled and maybe skeptical or even scathing about the fact that we take a day like today as the Jews will take Yom Kippur as their Good Friday. But it seems maybe to a mind that has not been touched by the truth of this mystery, that it's rather morbid, or rather there's a fixation upon suffering and death, and life is about celebration and having a good time, and it's a bit sadistic or masochistic or negative to be pondering the passion of Christ and the death and so on, as we will this afternoon, venerating the cross. So what does it mean? Well, I think we can only really connect with the meaning through our own experience and our own reflection, although to read the letter to the Hebrews and to read the great commentaries down history will help us to make that connection with our own experience. Simone Weil says somewhere that there is an important distinction to be made between affliction and suffering. She uses the word affliction. And suffering, she said, is like intense pain. So you have a toothache, and if you tell someone you have a toothache, they say, "Oh, I'm sorry, have you taken a paracetamol?" Although it's difficult to, maybe you could empathize with someone who has toothache, but it's difficult to feel compassion for them, because we know, and even the person who's suffering from the pain knows it can be easily cured. At the worst, you take the tooth out and the pain has gone, or you have treatment on it and it's fixed, or you take some medication and the pain is controlled. So it's not pleasant, and it's to be avoided whenever possible, but it's not mysterious. And after the pain has gone, the treatment's been done, you haven't changed very much, probably. Maybe you'll be careful how many sweets you eat, or whether you eat on that side of your mouth or not, but the change that it has worked in you is a little habitual rather than really existential. So by contrast with suffering or pain, there is what she calls affliction. And affliction is what we see Jesus enduring. Now there is some pain, obviously, and suffering in affliction too. You see, Jesus was suffered the pain of his passion, the torture, the crucifixion, and as well as the psychological pain. But the affliction of Jesus is really the fact that his very identity, his very set of relationships, the web of relationships that that give us our identity, our sense of security, our sense of meaning, that is ripped away. It's like breaking a spider's web. And you see, when you break a spider's web, you see the spider sort of really desperate, doesn't know what to do. So affliction is when the web of being that we feel part of and that both supports us and gives us our place, our connection, our relationship, that is destroyed. Simone Weil uses the idea of slavery to describe this. A slave, and today we could think about, of course, the terrible scourge of human trafficking or the enforced prostitution of women from Eastern Europe or Africa. So slavery, to be a slave, is to have your very identity ripped away. You have no rights. You have no recourse. And what you find terribly is that even normal people run away from you, or even worse, put the boot in and enjoy humiliating you. Because you have no identity, no value. So this is the meaning for her of affliction. And I think if we to understand the mystery of Good Friday, the mystery of the cross, we need to see that Jesus is not only enduring physical pain and suffering, but he is actually enduring this affliction. Now, this is the sacrifice that we are pondering today. We are not saved so much by the suffering, the pain, the nails in his hands and feet. We're not saved so much by that as by the results or the influence or the fruits of what Jesus passed into in his affliction. And death is an affliction. In death, we, at least we can imagine, that our identity is snuffed out. Our identity ceases at least in any relational way. This is the terrible silence of death. You can be with someone, caring for them for a long period of time in, say, a terminal illness. And you can see them fading and getting closer to death. And that feeling of loss and the pain of loss is getting stronger and stronger. But they're still there, they're still with you. The connection is still there. And the identity is still there. And your identity is still in touch with their identity to some degree, even if it's just, the breath that keeps that identity connected to you. And then, even though you may not even be hoping for a miracle cure, you may have accepted the fact that the person is dying. But that doesn't mean that when the end comes, everything doesn't collapse. Identity collapses. That your relationship is forever changed. and nothing can turn the clock back. You are now facing a relationship at a completely different level of existence. And in your own way, you as the survivor are just as at a loss as we imagine the person who died is. There is simply no communication. I think the webcast just lost connection a few minutes ago. So is it back?
Yes.
Good. So
Blackout.
what?
Blackout.
A blackout. Okay. So anyway, just maybe that was a little reminder of what I'm talking about. That this connection can feel broken.
Just another time. No, it's middle.
Gosh, I better not. Better change. Better start talking about the resurrection. Anyway, we'll carry on. So, you know, this is what I mean by the personal experience of the mystery of Good Friday. It's rooted in our personal experience of death and of loss, and the transformation of identity that happens through that. Now, what makes this a sacrifice? Certainly it's true that it is possible, I hope those of you who have experienced death will have some experience of this as well. For a person to die with all the consequences of death, but to die in a way that blesses the people around them. A peaceful death, a good death. In the ancient Christian tradition, life was seen as a preparation for death. Death was our passage to the next world, and so preparing for a good death was a very meaningful way of living. And it's possible to die in anger, in bitterness, in despair, raging, you know, like Dylan Thomas, do not go quietly into that dark night. Or it is possible to have reached the place, an interior place, a place of peace and certainty, which enables you to embrace death, to accept it, and to pass through it. And the consequence of that is a blessing on the people around you. Even though they will suffer the pain of losing you, the connection of love is stronger than the pain of death. So that's another option, and I think this is another possibility which transforms the meaning of death. So a death that we go through with this connection of love is a very different kind of death than what we see on TV in our death-obsessed entertainment industry, or that we see in many intensive care wards in hospitals today, where death has been medicalized, and these last sacred, precious moments of life are seen as, in terms of desperate attempts to succeed in keeping the person biologically alive for as long as possible. So, but here is another approach to death, and this is the approach that I think we can see in the way the story is told at this point. And this is what we come closer to understanding by participating this afternoon in the liturgy of the Passion, and that very sacred moment in the liturgy where we come forward to venerate the cross, if we choose. I think in the older history of that liturgy, that there was no communion service. You know, Mass is not celebrated on Good Friday, which is a very powerful symbol, as it just reminds us of the finality of death. And I personally think it's a little weak, a bit of a weak compromise to have a communion service on Good Friday. But anyway, we will. But it doesn't mean that we're play acting that Jesus is not there. We know he's there. This is where I think a contemplative celebration of Good Friday probably wouldn't insist on the communion service. But anyway, it's not so important perhaps. But but today we have the opportunity to enter into that, to come closer to that. This kind of death and this meaning of the mystery. It remains a mystery because we can't see around the corner. We can't see what's on the other side. We can't describe it. We can't rationalize it. We can only be open to it. But that being open to it is what mystery is about. Mystery is there to change us because we enter it, or we place ourselves humbly in its presence, in front of it. And the key to this then is love. In a good death, there is a sort of an explosion of love. The love that is welcoming, you would say, the person who is dying, whose eyes are, and voice and appearance is often transfigured by this love. I remember some years ago I was visiting Calcutta, giving a retreat to Mother Teresa's sisters, and she said, "Oh, you must make sure while you're here, make sure you go down to our house for the dying." She said, "And I hope you get a really nice death while you're there," because we had beautiful deaths there. So I went, actually, very unsentimental lady. So I went down there, and true enough, the sisters who were running the place asked me to go over and said, "Would you give a blessing to this young man who's just been picked up off the streets yesterday?" And so I went over, and he was lying on the ground, very neatly and nicely looked after, but lying on the ground with his back towards me. And he was so still, I thought he was dead already, but anyway, I touched him lightly on the shoulder and said something, and he rather shocked me by turning around very quickly and looking at me. And what shocked me was the look in his eyes, and it was ecstatic. He was filled with God, with joy, with life, with brilliance and peace. His eyes were just filled with life. And naturally it was he who blessed me. And then he died very soon after that. So that, there is a death, a way of dying which is full of love, and which touches all the people around it, around the person who is dying. And that's why it's so important that in the care for the dying, we give maximum attention to the availability of the family and the friends, maximum emphasis upon healing the relationships and remaking the connections and having as much, as in traditional forms of death, where the whole village would come out. And even here in Bere Island, last year when Donal was dying in the house next to the church, he had a 6-week window for being diagnosed to dying. and he spoke to somebody on the phone and said, yes, they told me there's no hope. So he said, they said, would you like to stay here and be looked after in the hospital? So he said, no, I'm coming home. So, great medical service, they sent him here with a nurse, and he remained in his house, and I was here for most of that summer, and it was a beautiful thing, because people were dropping in all the time, and they weren't saying to him, we're praying that you will be saved, or praying a miracle will happen. They were praying for him, but it wasn't that kind of denial of reality, because he himself didn't need that. He was quite prepared. He was quite ready to go. It was sad, but it was also very peaceful, and it was a good death, a good Christian death. But without that, without the community, without the loving friends, and he was somebody who had a slightly satirical edge to him. I said to him once, I said, well, it must be wonderful to have all your friends and family around you. He said, yeah, a bit too many. So this was a good death. So I think when we look at the cross, we may think this doesn't look like a very good death. It's not like dying surrounded by your friends on Bere Island. But we do see a good death here, in the way the story presents it to us. We've spoken before about that quality of peace that fills Jesus after the Garden of Gethsemane, after that struggle between, as it were, the two wills, the human and the divine within him. This was a cosmic struggle that took place in him at that moment, and he resolved it, which reminds us that many of the most important stages in our life may happen chronologically in the last stages of our life. You may go 40 years without making much spiritual progress, and then you may leap ahead in the last few days or few hours, who knows. So we sort of think of time as money and divide up our time meaningfully in different stages of our life or our career, and there's a certain sense to that. But interiorly, in terms of consciousness and development of awareness, it may well be that the big leap forwards happen in the last lap. Sometimes runners get this surge of energy when they see the finishing line ahead of them. So after this struggle within himself, the two wills, Jesus emerges and enters into his affliction and his suffering, this total rejection, deconstruction of his identity. Remember, Palm Sunday, he was the successful candidate. He was being feted and applauded, and now he's being humiliated and ridiculed. So he's lost everything. And his friends have run away. He's on his own. The authorities, the institutions have turned against him, crushing him. So that's where he is. However, he goes through this with, I think we're meant to see, an extraordinary peace. And this is the last, in the Gospel of John, this is the last moment. Jesus, aware that all had now come to its appointed end. So the emphasis here is understanding. We saw that yesterday, the importance of understanding. He felt it was completed. His life fulfilled Scripture. And he said, I thirst. A jar stood there full of sour wine, so they soaked a sponge with the wine, fixed it on a javelin, and held it up to his lips. Having received the wine, he said, it is accomplished. Consummatum est, it's finished. He bowed his head, didn't drop his head, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. So he gave up his spirit, it wasn't ripped away from him. So he's awake. And then if we look at Luke's version at this moment, Luke describes Jesus in relationship to the two criminals on either side, one of whom is mocking him, so this duality carries on to the end, the other that defends him, sees this man has done nothing wrong. And he says, Jesus, remember me when you come to your throne. And Jesus answered, I tell you this, today you shall be with me in paradise. So, what do we see here? We see the other-centeredness of peace. I mean, this is his moment of ultimate affliction and loss and dying, and he is turning towards the good thief. Now it was about midday, and there came a darkness over the whole land, which lasted until 3 in the afternoon. The sun was in eclipse, so this the imagery here of a cosmic event. The curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus gave a loud cry and said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And with these words he died. So again, a death. He didn't want to die or choose to die, but he was making of his life a sacrifice, his offering. And in Mark, Jesus is being mocked again, and he cries out at 3 in the afternoon, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is a verse from the Psalms. An enigmatic cry. But it's not just an individual psychological cry of distress, it's a uniting of his experience with the collective experience. He's speaking the words of Scripture. And Jesus gave a loud cry and died. So this isn't, if we put all of these together, each of these camera shots, as it were, each of these perspectives add something, add a layer of meaning. And here we see the anguish is there as well. We were talking about this the other day. The anguish is also there. In the Gospel of Matthew, he similarly cries out in these words, and as a sort of irony, the bystanders hearing him misinterpret what he's saying, just as he'd been misinterpreted before. He said he's calling on Elijah. Jesus then gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And of course, the great example of how his death is a good death, and why we call this Friday good, is the forgiveness that he expresses just before his death, when he asks the Father to forgive them because they do not know what they are doing. So he is aware of their unawareness, and that's the highest level of compassion. To be conscious of other people's unconsciousness as their reason for being bad, or being inhuman. So at this crucial moment, Jesus is a channel of compassion, even to the people who are causing his affliction. Now, the key word to describe this whole process of Jesus' death that links it to his deepest identity and meaning is kenosis, or emptying. And this is first used to describe the incarnation itself. That God emptied himself in order for the incarnation, in order to become human. And this self-emptying of God is reflected in the self-emptying of Jesus at the end of his natural life. So it's this kenosis which is the key, as it were, to the transitional stages that we're witnessing, and to the achievement of his good and meaningful and redemptive death. It doesn't, as I say, explain it all away and reduce the mystery. The mystery of death remains a mystery. We can't see around the corner, we can't peer through the darkness. But the sensory connections have finished with those who have died. So, but nevertheless, we can experience that mystery through the self-emptying of love. So the death of Jesus and the birth of Jesus are really intimately connected, of course, in his identity, his true nature. God became human so that human beings might become God. That was the mantra of the early fathers of the church, from St. Athanasius on, repeated over and over again in their theology. God became human so that, emptying himself to become human, so that we could become divine. Theosis. The ultimate meaning of life in the Christian vision is theosis, becoming divine, divinity. So, where does this connection involve us? I think it involves us in what Jesus taught, what he spoke about, and later demonstrated in his own teaching of his own example, which is our own self-emptying, our own kenosis. That for us to be able to enter into, as it were, receive the gift, to enter into this mystery of Christ, the ocean of mystery, as Origen calls it, all we have to do is to begin to empty ourselves. And I think this is how we can truly understand the Christian meaning of meditation. John Main often said that every time we meditate, we enter into the paschal mystery of Christ, which means his dying, his self-emptying, and the resurrection. So, it's our meditation itself, the deeper meaning of prayer, where we let go of ourselves. We, as it were, make the sacrifice of ourselves through the work of attention, the work of love. It's that which then connects us to the great ocean, to the great event that we are pondering as well as we can today.